I'm interviewing a lot of fascinating experts, and I have plenty of people talking about ancestral healing from a shamanic or even psychological perspective. But I'm particularly interested in hearing you talk about the hard science of epigenetics as it relates to ancestral healing, because that's where your expertise lies. And I'm hoping you could share a little bit about that.
It's also full of surprises because we used to think that while certain behavioral traits were passed along from generation to generation, like just for example, maybe your parents, your grandparents lived in a place where there was a certain threat, then they may have passed along an awareness of that threat to the next generation, and it kind of got passed down for many generations. But we never thought 15, 20 years ago that gene shifts epigenetically can be passed along, like for example, traits or habits or beliefs can be passed along from one generation to the next. So the first research into that was stunning, and we're now showing that all kinds of things are passed along epigenetically with no alteration to the genome, just that in our epigenome, certain beliefs, traits, habits, states, moods are passed along. I'd love to explore that with you.
All right, wonderful. Well, I would love to hear some specific examples or anecdotes. I know you've got tons of those with all your years of work in this topic.
Well, the first one was done, the first thing that was really just landed like a bombshell in the world of science was a study of mice. And what they did was they trained mice to be afraid of a certain scent, happened to be cherry blossom scent. And the mice were just given a shock and trained to associate that scent with stress. And what they found was that in the offspring of those mice, that the offspring were afraid of the cherry blossom scent, even though they'd never been associating, had any cause to associate the shock that their parents had received with that scent. Not only that, they passed that fear along to their offspring, they passed it to their offspring, and the researchers actually did this for 7 generations and found that fear was passed along epigenetically. That means no alteration in the DNA, but that in the epigenome, in the little chemical tags that we have on our genome that determine whether genes are expressed or silenced, those epigenetic characteristics were passed along. This was a completely new idea in science, and we found now that these things can be passed along not just through the females of a species, but through the males as well, through the sperm as well as through the egg. Then researchers said, okay, let's try and see if we can trace this in people. And what they found, for example, was that the daughters of mothers who were depressed had the same epigenetic tags as their mothers, even though they may have had no reason to be depressed, and then their daughters were depressed as well. So the granddaughters of those original mothers had those epigenetic signatures of depression, even though they had never, again, had any reason to be depressed themselves. So there are all these ways in which these characteristics get passed from generation to generation, and what you are thinking and feeling and believing about the world might not be yours at all, might come down from a grandparent or even a great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparent.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. In my own research into this, I've discovered that there are connections from my ancestral story. I've mentioned this in the past where, for example, my mother is severely claustrophobic, and we didn't put 2 and 2 together until we found out, well, her father and her grandfather and all of them before them were coal miners. So, and then some of them died in a mine explosion. So now my mom is claustrophobic. I'm also really, really, what's what I'm looking for? I react like, I have a very easy startle point. Loud noises, I get unreasonably startled. And I'm thinking it's because of this coal mine explosion that my family experienced. So is that the kind of thing that you're talking about?
Yes, and those responses were really valuable to our ancestors. In fact, the quicker your ancestors' startle response was, the more likely it was they would see the anomaly, the problem in the world around them, and react to it. So if, for example, there was a waiting stand of reeds on the way to the river to collect water 100,000 years ago, and among that pattern of yellow and black of the reeds, if your ancestor was the one that had the best ability to see the tiger and the tiger's stripes in among the reeds, that was the ancestor that lived. That gave that ancestor a hair-breadth start running and activating the fight or flight response to escape from danger. So back along the evolutionary pathway, the ability to have a quick startle response, the ability to get upset and angry and have your emotions on a hair trigger, the ability to have high cortisol, high adrenaline really fast, have those genes snap on in milliseconds, that was a really valuable survival advantage that our ancestors had. And so those that had the best ability to get startled and to get anxious and angry and paranoid, those that did that fastest lived. The ones that were happy and mellow. Now, of course, we've been bred for thousands of generations to have that quick response to imagine threats, and there are no more tigers in the grass. But what there are paper tigers in our minds. There are thoughts we have about, gee, you know, am I wearing the right shirt for this particular color? Does it match my socks? Will my wife be mad at me if I stay at work half an hour late? Might I make the wrong choice about this career path? And so our minds are absolutely filled with these kinds of worries. In fact, not only are our minds filled with those kinds of worries when we have something to focus on, when we're idle, there's part of the brain called the default mode network. And it's a very misunderstood part of the brain. And when you're doing a task, when, for example, you're navigating a new city, when you're writing an email or a blog post, when you are focused on mathematics or a musical composition, when you're doing something with your brain is really highly active. But when you're doing nothing, your brain is churning away just as much as when it's focused on a task. And what your brain is churning away on has been a mystery to scientists for years. Why is your brain running at this really fast pace when you're resting, when you're on vacation, when you're doing nothing? The brain's energy output, the brain's energy consumption only drops by about 5%, even when you're doing nothing at all. What is the brain doing? And it turns out what the brain is doing is rehearsing every bad thing that ever happened to you and every bad thing that might happen to you, because that's how your ancestors survived. They thought about the tiger in the grass they saw 40 years ago. They thought about the tiger in the grass they might see on the next journey to the river. And that is what the brain does all the time. It's called the default mode network. But when researchers look at people and ask them what they're doing at various times, and that default mode network has kicked in, they are unhappy. They tend to be thinking unhappy thoughts about the past or the future. And so now those are driving our stress levels sky high when there are no actual threats to our survival, and those things are shortening our lives. High cortisol is associated with the loss of memory and learning. High cortisol is associated with the loss of bone density, of skin elasticity, that's wrinkles, of loss of muscle mass, of loss of cognitive abilities over time, of loss of immune function. All kinds of bad thing happens when you're driving your stress level sky high. So that's the predicament of the modern human being. We have these brains that are exquisitely attuned to the bad stuff, and there's no more stuff out to get us that way, the same way anymore, but our brains are cranking away that way all the time. And that is what's driving our current levels of stress high and degrading our health in the current environment.
Right. And it almost seems like there's really nothing that can be done about this, but I know that's not right. So I wonder, can you offer maybe some suggestions for solutions? That I think would be very helpful.
I'll tell you another problem as well as a solution. So I'm a meditator, and I'm guessing many people listening to us now have tried to meditate in the past. Most of us, though, are unsuccessful. Research shows that most people who try and meditate then give up after a short while, because you sit down and you try and quiet your mind. When you try and quiet your mind, the default mode network kicks in and starts filling your mind with these worries and plans and fears and all this other junk. So we try and get out of our heads with things like meditation, but it's hard, because the moment there's a big empty space, then our default mode network kicks in and fills it with worries and fears and all those other things. So meditation is one solution if you learn to quiet the default mode network. Research into Tibetan monks who've been meditating for decades shows that they are able to quiet, there's one big brain region in the front here, another one in the back here, that govern the default mode network. And research into those Tibetan monks shows that they are able to quiet that part of the default mode network and then quiet the rest of the brain. And the brain then goes quiet, and they then do have real peace. And so you need to learn to meditate in ways that bring you real peace. And I've been developing a method of meditation over the last few years that really does help people still their active minds and find that inner peace. But it takes work. So energy therapies do that. If you go and, for example, get massage, the massage therapist will be touching your body. They'll be generating small electrical currents inside your body called piezoelectricity, and that electricity travels throughout your connective tissue in your body and calms you. Acupuncture, when that acupuncturist inserts the needle, that is releasing blockages in the energy flows in your body, and that helps calm you. So all of those are effective therapies. In my book, Mind to Matter, I list 30 things you can do to try and reverse this. And if you practice those things repeatedly, often enough, eventually you are able to quiet that busy brain and then find real inner peace. But the key is to use one that's effective for you, that fits your lifestyle, and that you will practice to the point where you've built up enough neural capacity to make it a state rather than a trait. There's a wonderful story in my book, Mind to Matter, about this astrophysicist who was a real non-believer in meditation and acupressure and energy and all these things, but he decided to go on an 8-week journey to learn mindfulness. And researchers looked at him, gave him a big battery of tests before the 8 weeks and after the 8 weeks. And so before he began his journey, they got him into an MRI lab, and they measured the volume of every single part of his brain, down to the last cluster of neurons. They knew exactly how much neural tissue he had in each part of his brain, because they knew that over 8 weeks, neural growth would occur, neurogenesis would occur as he used new neural pathways. So after 2 weeks, his behavior began to change. He had less road rage, he had less fits of anger against his family, against his team. Then after 8 weeks, these researchers got him back into the lab. And in chapter 2, I have the whole story of how this guy went back into the lab after 8 weeks, only 8 weeks, 2 months, and they measured his brain again. They found that parts of his brain had grown by 2, 4, 5% in just 8 weeks. But one part of his brain grew a lot, and that's a part called the dentate gyrus, which is part of the emotional brain, and the dentate gyrus governs the regulation of emotion across multiple brain regions. This is what keeps you calm when you're stuck in traffic, when you're in line, when you have to wait for a promotion, when your spouse is doing something that annoys you, when your kid is getting on your nerves. If you have strong emotional regulation abilities, then you can calm yourself in all those circumstances. And the researchers found that in just 8 weeks, his dentate gyrus, as neural plasticity kicked in, his dentate gyrus grew by 22.8% in just 2 months. That is how startlingly quickly parts of the brain remodel themselves as we train ourselves in effective meditation and mindfulness techniques. So it's really important. There are techniques, and they're not just changing our transient temporary states. They're literally changing our traits. That will now be a much calmer man, a much more considerate man, a much more compassionate man, because he has a more compassionate brain. He has the hardware in his brain to be resilient in the face of annoyance. So it's not just changing. When we become more enlightened, when we shift ourselves, it's not just a good feeling that's temporary. It literally becomes, over time, the hardware of your brain. So it's amazing what we can do to shift our bodies and our brains with these wonderful kinds of new techniques.
Right, and then if I have this correctly, the man that you're just talking about would then change his DNA, and therefore any children that he would have would now inherit the new traits. Is that accurate?
Right, yes. They'll no longer be impatient. They'll no longer be having that hair trigger anger response. They'll have better emotional regulation. He'll pass these things along to his offspring epigenetically.